Prakash will be sharing some of his research with us, which promises to be very exciting and is directly related with many of the questions and concerns that many of us are facing in our work in contemporary politics in India today. He's in particular going to be talking about institutional reforms and effective delivery of entitlements. But I think the most interesting part, at least for me, of what Prakash is going to present is that for once we will move beyond India and learn about what's happening in other parts of the world to be able to see if there are lessons for the debates we are having here in India today from experiences in other countries, which is something quite rare, because I find usually when people are working on India, they get so obsessed with India, and comparisons usually are across states rather than across countries. And I, for one, know very little about what's going on in the rest of the world, because I'm so absorbed in trying to make sense of the complexity of what's going on here. So I think there'll be a lot to learn from this presentation. So thank you very much, Prakash, for agreeing to come and present your work, and look forward to hearing you.
Thank you, Yamini, for this very generous and affectionate introduction. It's a real privilege to be here, and thank you all for being here. If you weren't already scared, Yamini already scared you that, by the time you get out of the talk, it might be a big storm. And I hope that, the discussions that we'll have after the talk will be fruitful and productive, and will help us make real progress on some of these discussions. As I started working on preparing the PowerPoint, I realized that I couldn't quite talk as much as I wanted to about the comparative part. I'll bring in some insights from Mexico, but I think because even the India part is done in a framework which is not common for the topic that I'm going to talk about. So I'll have to talk a little bit about that, and then get back to the comparative lessons. So this was part of Mr. Modi's picture is from Gujarat when he was going to distribute some of the early titles or pretend titles as part of the Forest Rights Act. That's the core evidence that I rely on, and then I'll sort of extrapolate from that to talk about institutional reforms in general. So I look at Forest Rights Act, which many of you are familiar with, but I'll talk very briefly about what FRA is and what the outcomes were. In particular, I want to talk about how did different actors responded to the Forest Rights Act, right? And that goes beyond just talking about who's not doing what, but at a more abstract level, how people are thinking about questions of state, society, property rights, and so forth. Then I would particularly want to engage you on questions of how political parties and elected leaders have engaged with or have not engaged with the process, and then come to structural and institutional drivers of reform outcomes before I bring in some lessons from Mexico and propose some suggestions and open up for discussions about how we could actually go about planning some kind of institutional and structural reforms vis-a-vis the questions of forest land rights and so forth. So as many of you may know, Forest Rights Act intends to or is meant to address a very long-standing problem of conflicts of land rights within forested areas. So I have a little graphic for you to see. In the good old days, there used to be like scattered households that would call themselves a clan or a group or something. It wasn't really like formally defined villages with some fields. The checkered parcels that you see, these are fields, and of course households. And they would, as they would expand, right? There was nothing preventing them other than their own sort of mutual agreements. But then came the British Forest Department from 1865 onwards, and they set in the capitals, and they decided that particular area is going to be state forest land, right? So this is the root cause of the conflict that is described as historical injustice as part of the Forest Rights Act, right? Of course, because these problems were not resolved even after independence, then this led to more complications, more people making some opportunistic land claims and so forth. But this is the original historical problem. Now, in many cases, the demarcation of village boundaries happened after the demarcation of forest areas. So even those village boundaries are not really proper village boundaries in many cases, and that's a complication that is not often talked about. What FRA does is that it recognizes private household land rights to the houses that the checkered parcels, farmlands that you see. It also recognizes the homestead lands, and finally it also recognizes the collective forest rights to any parcels or areas of forest that people may have been traditionally using and may want to make a claim about. So this is the sort of basic idea of Forest Rights Act, and it has a long process. There are lots of procedural rights that are given to the people who are supposed to be the intended beneficiaries of the Forest Rights Act, and I'll talk about some of them a little later. When you look at a multi-layered, historical, complex problem like this, which would be many of the institutional reforms that we tend to study, they all have historical elements, complex political, economic layers, and so forth. It's important to have a methodology that gives you both the breadth and the depth, right? So in my own research, I examine patterns of whatever land rights claims that are being made, for example, to look at what is the extent of claim, who's making, what is the variation in claim, and all of that is sort of data-centric statistical analysis. But you can't understand the drivers of outcomes just by doing statistical analysis, which tends to happen many a times. There's this concept called equifinality of outcomes, which means that same outcome can happen because of different drivers in different places. You'll see a claim being made for 3 different reasons in 3 different places, right? And understanding that requires that you deal with the entrenched nature of relationships, political economic relationships, both at micro and meso levels, and that is done through the tools of institutional ethnography and political ethnography. So that's sort of the methodological approach that I use. In terms of the theoretical foundations of the research, I rely on new institutional economics. At the very basic, institutions are defined as the rules, norms, and outcomes, rules, norms, and conventions. So this is different from thinking about institutions as agencies or organizations. In fact, there's a strict differentiation, that is difference maintained between institutions and organizations. Most of the times, people also think of institutions that are rules, norms, and conventions that are widely understood and socially accepted. But there's a twist to this that I'll bring on later on. So the institutions, when they are designed by policymakers, they are meant to induce expectations, incentives, and disincentives, right? So traffic light is a good example. It's supposed to tell all the travelers or drivers what to expect when you reach a stop sign, right? So that everybody stops, and then there are rules about who goes first. So that's an institution, right? Property rights are similarly supposed to tell other people that, this is under somebody's property right, you're not supposed to do this, you can do this, and all of that, right? So this is the bare minimum definition of institutions that is used by most institutional analysts, right? And if we were to go by this definition of institutions, we would expect certain things to happen as a result of the FRA, as was widely debated when the FRA was being introduced. As I said, there are lots of procedural rights that the potential beneficiaries of this law enjoy in the process. So they themselves actually adjudicate, in a sense, at the community level. They decide about their own claims, in a sense, right? And because of that, there was an expectation that there will be many fake claims. And there was also a significant role for elected representatives, both at the subdivisional level committees that were supposed to adjudicate the forest rights land claims, and at the district level committees. And so those elected representatives, again, were expected to exploit their positions on these committees to further their career goals, political careers, right? So if I'm on the committee, I can go and tell 100 people that, look, I'll approve your claim, but you either pay me a bribe or you have to vote for me for 7 generations. That's the going rate, right? When you give a land title, your 7 generations are bound to vote for the party or the leader, right? So both of these expectations would tell us that there would be a lot of claims as part of Forest Rights Act, because at least the claim making part is under the control of village communities. There's nobody who's denying them the right to make claims. So if 4 hectares is allowed, everybody could make 4 hectares claim, at least in this kind of expectations about how the FRA incentives were aligned. And so the big debate, if you would remember, some of you who were around and engaged with that, was that the whole process of Forest Rights Act would create these perverse incentives for lots of fake claims, for clearing lots of forest land, and it will lead to decimation of forest land. And some of the estimates were about 40% of the entire forest land in the country will be cleared. I mean, this is in black and white, right? So this is no gossip columns. And 40% of claims would basically mean about 30 million hectares, right? So that was the extent of loss that was expected as a result of the Forest Rights Act. And if you look at the political, economic, and the economic context of the poor tribal communities, any opportunity that they would have to secure a piece of land will never be let go of, because land is precious for a variety of reasons, as all of we know. So politicians would do this, people would do this. So as a result of that, there was supposed to be lots of claims, lots of forest clearing, and lots of fights. Actually, none of this happened. By now, we know that the claim making, right? So there's a lot of discussions about rejection of claims and all of that. I will show you the data about forest land claims, and even the claim making process has been kind of very subdued. It's been much less than was expected. Claimants and even social movements have played defense. They've been very defensive about these individual forest rights claims. And of late, you will hear that most of the individual forest rights claims have been settled to the extent they could be settled. And there's a lot of emphasis on collective forest rights, which on the one hand is a good thing, but on the other hand, I also argue that this is part of that defensive approach to Forest Rights Act, where people are trying to say, no, we are not destroying your forest, give us collective rights and we'll protect forests. Right? And there's a long history of this kind of adaptive, defensive kind of discourses. The least active players in this game in most states, except for a couple of states, have been political parties and elected representatives. And as we would say, they've been totally inactive. Right? I mean, they have not done anything. They've not gone out to people and said, take that land and give me a vote. Right? Or even bribe me. In some small cases there have been bribing cases, but in most cases leaders have been very inactive. So I'm looking at these outcomes, and this to me is a big puzzle, because everything that we would expect from these basic theories of institutional analysis would tell us that there would be lots of claims, would tell us that politicians would go and market this law as a big political thing, as a vote gathering machine. And would tell us that there will be a lot of conflicts. There would be everybody would claim 4 hectares, even if they didn't farm for 4 hectares. So when you don't see any of those outcomes for something as valuable as land, we need to explain that, right? And that explanation and that journey of sort of examining these puzzles and trying to understand is basically my work. And that, I argue, tells us a lot about how strong is the investment of various actors in the institutional status quo. What are the forces that are maintaining the status quo and that assured that there would be minimum claims under the Forest Rights Act. And again, please remember, I'm only talking about claims which were entirely within the control of people and local communities, right? So the entire argument about the Forest Department sabotaging the process and rejection of claims, all of that is beyond this point, right? So whatever we are trying to understand is basically about looking at FRA and trying to see how these actors reacted at the base level before the rejection happens and all of that. And the role of Ministry of Environment and Forest and state forest departments is particularly interesting in this regard. So this is the data I was talking about, but
we're just in the process of
so I'll show you this slide, which basically shows that if you look at the claim making, I have claim making data from at the national level, at the state level, at the district level, at the village level, at all of these different levels. If you aggregate claim making, the average area of land claims made under the Forest Rights Act, it's not more than 1.7, 1.8 hectares.
Sorry, it should just give it a minute. Sorry about
So the maximum claim that could be made under Forest Rights Act was 4 hectares, right? And the argument is that even if people didn't farm 4 hectares, they will expand their fields and make claims for 4 hectares, as per the anticipated outcomes.
So it's 4 hectares per person or per community?
Per household, right? So at wherever level I could get specific data about land rights claims. So this is data about land rights claims at various levels. So there's data in the first row. There's data from 60 villages in two districts that I collected. In the second row, there's data from 5 villages, 439 households. Then there are district level data. And so all of these are claim making data, and you'll see that for example in Kandhamal district, the average claim making, the claim per household is 0.64 hectares, as opposed to the 4 hectares outer limit, right? Look through the column, and all of this is, basically maximum is about 1.7 hectares. So completely underwhelming level of claim making under the FRA. So then I look at, and this is based on my own stratified random sample from 2 districts, 60 villages in Gujarat. And Gujarat, as you would know, is supposed to be, the economically advanced, market integrated, and all of that, which would mean that you would expect even more claims. But the average there in my sample was 1.63 hectares per household. So these were the factors. In a cross-sectional analysis, these were the factors that were associated with, comparatively speaking, larger areas of land claims at the village level. When village council leaders were part of the Forest Rights Committee, which means when panchayat leaders were part of the Forest Rights Adjudication Committee, you would see systematically larger claims compared to a similar village in which a village council leader was not on the committee. Social movements had highly significant influence on claim making process, and again remember that equifinality thing. In each of these factors there are multiple drivers that are leading to these outcomes. Electoral competition: if the village was situated in an assembly constituency with a higher level of electoral competition based on the data from 2007 assembly elections in Gujarat, then you would see a relatively higher claim making at the village level. On the other hand, particularly interesting are these factors which contribute to lower than expected or lower than average level of land claims under the FRA. If you have a forest protection committee in the village, it had a highly significant influence on the level of FRA land claims. You see systematically lower levels of claim making in villages with forest protection committee. When the leaders on Forest Rights Committee had earlier worked on these Forest Protection Committee and were engaged with Forest Department, that again made an additional negative impact on the area of land claims at the village level. And the distance from markets and irrigation, both of which you would also expect to lead to more market integration, and depending on how the markets are, either more or less claims. In this case, both distance from markets and the percentage of irrigated land were associated with lower claim making, right? So what it tells us, I want you to draw your attention to these 2 sets of factors. These forest protection related factors, this I based on the qualitative research that I'll share later on, little bit maybe, but a lot of this research is like overtime research for many years and 1 year of intensive field work. Is basically the relationship between forest department people and village leaders who have entered into a mutually symbiotic relationship about bringing in forest conservation project and making use of those projects for their own interest, right? So forest department has its own interest in promoting forest conservation at the village level, and forest leaders are similarly also interested in promoting forest conservation projects because it gets them funds, it gives them additional power to control village level decision making. Exposure tour पे जाते हैं, कभी कुछ infrastructure भी मिलता है, forest committee की नाम की chair आती है तो 2 chairs are at your house and all of that, right? So this is the political economy, micro political economy of forest conservation, undermining forest land claims. Now, if you happen to be an environmentalist, for you this is a good thing. If you happen to be a social activist, for you this is a bad thing, right? Because it's undermining the goals of social justice. This here again, what you're seeing is that market and advanced sort of commercial irrigated agriculture again associated with negative claims. This basically tells us that a lot of these claims are from people who are subsistence farmers, right? A majority of these claims are from really poor forest-based people who have not benefited from earlier rounds of similar kinds of titles and regularization and so forth. So this again, and this is more or less verified by my own fieldwork in Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, etc., etc. So this sort of gives an interesting argument about the conversation about environmental conservation versus social justice, right? Depending on what normative framework you come from, this has a particular meaning for you. So if the bare bones theory of institutional analysis that I laid out earlier, which was like this, if this was supposed to be the case, then we would expect lots of claims, lots of political leaders being very active, right? But that didn't pan out, and that is explained by a much thicker theory of institutional effects, which is that when you have institutions, particular kinds of rules, norms and conventions, right, it is associated with organizational arrangements such as the forest department establishment, their local offices, the kind of resources that they get from international conservation agencies, the kind of resources they can spare to co-opt village leaders and all of that, right? So all of that has to be accounted for as part of the institutional analysis, because institutions create particular kind of incentives and particular kinds of relationships based on where they are placed, in what kind of context they are placed. Right? So you have to look at these authority relationships between the forestry staff and the local leadership, and the differentiation within local communities that it contributes to, right? Because forest protection projects, for example, allow some leaders to gain more resources, gain more influence, and it actually imposes additional constraints on some other people, right? So if you got goats, they cannot be grazed because now the forest is under forest protection, right? So if you happen to be a poor person reliant on goat and sheep and those kinds of small ruminants, then forest protection is not good for you. But if you happen to be the leader who is actually taking control of this, then forest protection is good for you, right? So the institutions of forest property rights, which vest this particular kind of control in the hands of forestry department, has these particular kinds of impacts. And this we could also extrapolate to other kinds of established relationships in areas such as development and gram panchayats and so forth. And so this has applications beyond this particular question of forest land rights. National park, similarly tourism, local economy, different types of people benefit from these projects in different ways. This is the same framework explained in a more diagrammatic format, where I'm basically showing how you have these right. So this is the historical legacies, for example, of forest land control, mediated by the interest of forest officials and local village leaders, and they actually create a particular kind of environment for institutional reforms, both at the national level and at the local level. And whatever comes out of this process actually reinforces the original status quo, right, or the historical political context that has been there. And so this reinforcement, every time you have a failed institutional reform, it strengthens the institutional status quo. Every time you have a successful institutional reform, it weakens a little bit the institutional status quo. So the historical memory that people have about similar kind of laws plays a very important role in how people react to something like Forest Rights Act. So in many villages you would see activists trying their best, spending nights and organizing these meetings, camps and everything, bringing out posters and everything, promising that look, we've been trying for 30 years, but this time it is really different. This time it is a law. This time Forest Department is not going to play spoil sport. And you would see on the other hand these hardened by their own experience people who would say, no, this, we have heard this so many times. We have prepared these forms so many times. I'm not going to believe in this. Not going to waste my time. So there were some people who had genuine claims under Forest Rights Act and they did not submit claims because their prior experience was so strong and their assumption and their understanding about what was going to happen in response to FRA was so strong that they didn't believe the activists or the social workers despite their best efforts. Unfortunately, in many cases, those hardened people and their positions were reinforced. They were vindicated because actually many of the claims got rejected and many of the claims were approved only after bribing and all. Forest Department did play a very important role in the process, right? So because I was doing this research while the implementation was still was continuing, I could actually see these kinds of discussions and then the fallout of actual failed implementation. And so now in places where Forest Rights Act has failed, though the status quo of this thing has even become very, very strong. And so next time you bring another round of reform, you have to make even harder efforts. And so this again, for rural development, for service delivery, for right to education, right to food, all of these things play out in a sort of similar kind of approach. So, how much time I have?
You have another 20 minutes.
Oh, that's great. So I want to switch gears a little bit. So this was about the essential outcomes and how we would sort of theoretically understand the process. And I showed you the data. And now I'm going to show you the qualitative evidence, sort of selective qualitative evidence, which is representative of many other similar interviews and discussions that I've had with each of these actors. So first of all, of course, forest officials, because they are the most important beneficiary of the status quo, because as long as the forest land remains in their control, they control international funding and so forth. So the big thing was that, as you know, all of these land claims before the Forest Rights Act came, they were illegal encroachments, right? So they were, as per the 1927 colonial law, which continues to be in operation even today, anybody who was farming a piece of land as a result of that historical problem that we talked about earlier, was a criminal, gunegar, right? So Forest Department still continues to believe very strongly, and I've knowingly used the word understanding in quotes because I think, and somebody can correct me, the word perception has a different connotation. And I say this is understanding as opposed to perception because it's based on what they genuinely believe, right? So as opposed to saying that, either he's pretending or he's ignorant or whatever, they genuinely believe that these are criminals, people who farmed forest land, they are criminals, and why should a law reward criminals instead of actually rewarding people who for whatever reason could not actually farm, And so this was in 2009. First set of interviews were conducted in 2009, and now I met many more officials in this summer, and you hear the same kind of arguments, right? So there's been no change over past 6 years in this kind of discourse that Forest Department officials. And I think there's been enough discussion of this, but what really worries the Forest Department is that, and this is something that was said to me recently by a very senior retired forest officers in one of the states, is that Forest Rights Act strikes at the very reason for existence of Forest Department, right? And these two words are basically from a forest officials interview. Says forest officials at the local level do two things. First, they danda maro anybody who enters forest area, right? Penalize them, book cases against them. Penalization is actually a big part of their job. And Forest Rights Act decriminalizes a lot of these penalizable activities, right? And secondly, through the collective forest rights, it takes away the protection part being the exclusive domain of Forest Department. So in that sense, Forest Rights Act is not just about those small parcels of land, but it actually threatens the very existence of forest department in some perspective of these things, right? Not in an absolute sense, but in one way of thinking about this. And the additional evidence is that for many of the lower officials, they're actually thinking about मेरे को VRS मिलने वाला है. They think that we will be retired because now forests will be managed to communities, will be given over to communities and so forth. Right? So for them it's much more than just about that particular land rights, and they won't let any of the elements of Forest Rights Act become operational, because anything becomes operational and it takes them closer to the VRS or closer to losing control over the land. Right? And so this is, I wanted to just show you quickly. What we often hear is that there is so much of forest loss because of agriculture and all of those encroachments and everything. There have been so much of diversion of forest land. But if you look at the actual data from 1960, and I look at 1960 because it's post Jamindari, where all of the basic resettlement was already done, Forest Department has gained 30%, 20 million hectares in net forest land since 1960. Right? Remember, there's been about 6 to 8 million hectares of diversion, which means that in total that had to be compensated for a net additional gain, right? So in total, between 1960 and now, Forest Department has gained 26 to 28 million hectares of land under their control. Now, nobody can actually do an analysis of where this land came from. But I have some fragmented evidence which suggests that much of this land had come from village common lands, village revenue wastelands, which were supposed to be for redistribution among landless, which were supposed to be for village amenities like hospitals, anganwadis and so forth, right? So when we talk about potential loss of forest land, we have to actually think about this equation and see that, so much of land Forest Department has actually captured from village communities, from commons, from open access land and so forth. And just to put things in perspective, the land that is right now approved under individual land claims, and it is nowhere near to being finally settled in a sense, because there has to be a revenue entry and all of that, that's 4 million hectares, right? And that is about 4 to 5% of the total forest land as of today, and 1/5 of the additional 28 million hectares, 1/7 of the 28 million hectares that Forest Department has somehow gained control over these, right? So all of these discussions about forest loss and the ramification for these populist schemes for forest conservation, climate change and all of that has to be put in perspective. Then there is this mind-boggling hierarchy of forest officialdom, which is nowadays officially called as an inverted pyramid, because there are more officials at the highest levels than at the lowest levels. And this is just the central government. You can actually recreate this figure 30 times, however many states we have now. That's the amount of forest bureaucracy we have. And what are they doing? In one of the states, the forest secretary, who happens to be an IAS officer, he called the forest officials and he said, 2015 marks 25 years of joint forest management program, right? It's a participatory forestry program. Show me the evidence that joint forest management has been effective, either at conservation or at facilitating local livelihoods and so forth. And somebody who was part of that discussion told me that senior forest officials had no answer to that question. They could not explain what they have done in 25 years of JFM, right? And they are continue to harp on penalization and protection like regimented protection where nobody else can do anything. And just one more thing, if you happen to live in a forest village, your birth certificate is maintained by forest officials. And the moment your son goes to school, you have to actually go to the range officer, pay them a bribe and get a certificate of birth so that you can be admitted in a school, right? So there's an enormous amount of control that Forest Department exercises over the lives of forest dependent people, which we don't get to talk about very often in the heated debates of social justice versus environmental conservation, right? And I want to argue that the failure of Forest Rights Act has as much to do with this hierarchy and has as much to do with this, the need to maintain control over this land, as it has to do with all of the other things that have been talked about. So I want to briefly come to the Mexican case, but and this again is a paraphrasing. The state within the state is again a paraphrasing of a very senior minister who I met recently. He said they consider themselves as sovereign republic within the Indian Republic, right? They have territorial jurisdiction, so their responsibility is not just about overlooking forest, overseeing forest protection, but also they control land, birth certificates and roads, and Anganwadis and all of that, NREGA, and we talk about convergence and we add to that power and that control and that centralization of control, right? I won't go into this, but there's a long history of progressive centralization on every single dimension of forest governance. Right? JFM was converted into forest development agencies, and all of the officials, account holders and bank, everything is maintained by forest officials. Buffer zone around protected areas which were supposed to be for livelihood of the forest dependent people, these buffer zones have been converted into extended parks and extended portion of core areas, and they are now managed at integrated buffer zone management. In no other country one ministry or one department controls all international environmental agreements. Anything international is all controlled by within the same group of people. So there's now carbon forestry and all of that. Incredible amount of centralization, and there's very little criteria for the assessment of success or failure, and that's why you hear Lodi Garden being counted as forest, because ultimately you have to show your forest from somewhere, right? So you bring in Lodi Garden, you bring in all the rubber plantations and everything that you can bring in. So that's enough, but I want to talk about the dynamic effect that this amount of power and authority has on all the other actors, right? Forest department also funds or supports political leaders in a variety of ways. Mining leases, कोई पकड़ा गया तो उसको छुड़वाने के लिए किसी का truck let it pass through the forest area, jobs and all of that, right? Timber for furniture and all of that. So elected representatives are completely in a very strong symbiotic relationship with the forest department. I want to come to those quotes. And even people have, because of these repeated failures of past reforms, people have actually given up, and they sort of have acquired this kind of discourse that we are farming by stealth. हम लोग तो चोर हैं और ये तो forest department की ज़मीन है, अब हमको कैसे मिलेगी, right? It's not that they it's complicated, but they have come to acquire this kind of discourses. And so this I really want to read, even though I'm running out of time. For people who have always been on the wrong side of the law, they have an incredible amount of trust in the rule of law kind of framework, right? So this is a quote from one of the secretaries of the Forest Rights Committee, and he says that the question of rights must be seen within the law. I cannot claim the whole world as my law, right? Without the evidence of that, the penal evidence that I was talking about related to the illegal farming, I cannot claim that right? So even the unjustified penalization becomes part of the rule of law in a sense, right? So you see how this actually weaves back into the way in which people actually believe in the idea of government, the sarkar, the state, and so forth. Elected representatives are similarly sort of, they have a strong belief in the authority of forest department. So when, activists repeatedly talk to these leaders who were on these committees, they said, forest department is definitely the opposing party, but they are the owners of the land. So that whole discourse about Adivasis being the owner of land, that has not penetrated the political class, right? And so somehow someone has to find a way to engage with political leaders to get into these discussions about what is the basis for these entitlements, these progressive laws, and so forth. Right. So in Mexico in 1992, Mexico has a long history of agrarian communities owning a large areas of forest land and agricultural land. So these agrarian communities called ejidos, they own as in proprietorship ownership they cannot sell or anything, but they have full control over this land. They own 75% of forest land, 75% of country's forest land. They own 95% of the protected areas, which are called nature protected areas. They own 50% of country's agricultural land within these collective agrarian communities called ejidos. So in 1992, right before North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement was to come, one of the conditions for that was that this collective property rights regime had to be liberalized, right? And it's extremely interesting. I wish I had more time and I could talk about it. But the express intention of the reform was to break apart this collective property right regime and to liberalize it and to open it for markets. The way in which Mexican peasant communities are tied into political parties through peasant groups and continuous mobilization and ongoing discussions about policies and concessions and so forth, and the extent to which these communities have a confidence in their own ability to control the land that they already controlled, they did not fall for many of the incentives that were created through the reform process. Right? I'm sort of abstracting out because I think there's no time to sort of talk about the details. But in the end, the reform that was supposed to, these 29,162 ejidos comprising 5.6 million households, including all of this land, they were supposed to be liberalized and privatized and broken apart into small pieces. And very strong incentives were created. For example, other than the forest land, they could divide every other land, which includes large areas of pasture land and all of that. Because of the way in which these communities are organized, they actually exploited this counter reform. That's an official term that many of the scholars use. They used this counter reform to actually maintain control of all the land that they already had, to gain whatever they could gain without actually losing control of the land, which means they had the government created land records and mapped all the boundaries and did a whole lot of things. And in fact, they gained additional land. They took land out of the government forest reserves in some places wherever there were sort of boundaries matching between the agrarian communities and the forest department or the government land, which is very little anyway. And by the end of this process, which was supposed to weaken these communities, there were these additional, at least nearly 2,500 additional agrarian communities that came into existence, right? So what I'm showing you that in the Forest Rights Act, which was supposed to strengthen the forest land rights, it hasn't strengthened, and going by the logic that I presented, it might have even weakened some of the movement for reforms. The opposite effect in a democracy, right? But in Mexico, which is supposed to be an authoritarian state, a reform that was supposed to weaken these agrarian communities ended up strengthening these communities in the real sense that there were additional communities that were created during the process and they grabbed additional land, right? And this, so counterintuitive outcomes on both sides of the equation. And this, I argue again, is explained by the divided jurisdiction within the forestry agencies, which I'll talk a little bit about, and the very strong political oversight of the process of this reform. The party has promoted mass peasant organizations, and they have further promoted peasant leagues, regional federations and national confederations. The intention was political control of peasantry for political gains, but the unintended outcome was that it led to very strong political participation and over time accumulation of political confidence and political capital, right? And this, all of this taken together was actually used in very concrete ways, and I show examples of that in the manuscript that I just finished, led to the communities actually taking control of the reform process for their own gains and completely sort of overthrowing the plan that was charted from the central government. I think I'll stop here and then we'll get into discussion, and there are suggestions for reforms that I would invite from you, and I have some that I can bring in later on as part of the discussions. Sorry, I've taken longer than I was hoping to. Longer than I was hoping to.